Welcome to another virtual panel discussion of the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge in the UK. For the next hour, we will be discussing managing pandemics and mass atrocity risks in the Great Lakes region of Africa. Reported cases of COVID-19 in the region are still relatively low. Rwanda and Uganda, who have had some of the strictest lockdown regimes on the continent of Africa, have this week begun easing up. Both have so far reported no deaths, and the DRC, the hardest hit country in the region, has so far reported only 34 deaths. However, we have observed much business as usual activity in terms of drivers of conflict and atrocity in the region. DRC security forces are still engaged in ongoing offensives against the ADF militia in North Kivu and Ituri provinces, and have continued military efforts against Codeco, FDLR, and various Mai Mai militias. Meanwhile, intercommunal violence in Ituri and South Kivu continues. Each of these pressure points has resulted in attacks on civilians, extrajudicial killings, widespread displacement, and frequently sexual violence. And Burundi still plans to hold elections 2 weeks today on Wednesday, the 20th of May. This is despite COVID and reports on the risk of election-related atrocity risks by the Commission of Inquiry. If COVID does begin to spread more rapidly throughout the region, countries like the DRC, still recovering from outbreaks of cholera and measles, and yet to recover from Ebola, could be hit very hard. And it is widely recognised that states with recent experience of mass atrocities are at high risk of recurrence. And humanitarian crises, such as those posed by the pandemic, can exacerbate state stress and generate an environment conducive to atrocity crimes. Further, sudden shocks, economic, political, and even those such as we've seen from COVID, can act as sparks and provide pretexts for the onset of mass atrocities. And given the worrying confluence of these factors in the Great Lakes region, how concerned should outsiders be? And how can they provide support to mitigate the risks? These are some of the questions we'll be discussing today. I am Tom Peake, Research Associate at the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. I am joined today by Jaclyn Steinfeld-Hall, Publications Director at the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, Ambassador Liberata Mulamula, Visiting Scholar and Associate Director at the Elliott School of International Affairs, Institute for African Studies at George Washington University, and between 2013 and 2015, Ambassador of Tanzania to the United States and Mexico. She also served as the first Executive Secretary of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. And finally, Scott Strauss, Villast Distinguished Achievement Professor in Political Science and International Studies at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Welcome. And welcome also to our truly global audience. I encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please just type in and send your question, and it will be forwarded on to our panelists. Please do note if your question is directed to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. And also please do record your name and university or other institutional affiliation if you have one. Now, before we get around to questions, I will invite each of our speakers to say a few words, beginning with Jaclyn Steinfeld-Hall.
Thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and to the Center for Geopolitics for the invitation to speak today, and thank you to everyone who's tuning into this conversation. At the outset, I kind of want to lay out that it's important to remember that while for many of us the pandemic has brought life to a halt in numerous ways, ranging from limiting our capacity to go shopping or go to a public park. In many places, despite the pandemic and despite the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire 6 weeks ago, the risk of atrocities is still prevalent in the day-to-day reality for many populations. This is no different in the Great Lakes region. In the 2 months since the World Health Organization declared COVID a pandemic, there's been this really interesting juxtaposition between a lot of cautiousness about the disease. As Tom noted, Uganda and Rwanda implemented very strict measures. Other countries have implemented interesting border measures, have been taking temperatures at the border, lots of people wearing masks, and all sorts of disease mitigation measures. But at the same time, there's been either at the same level or even an uptick in atrocity risks for populations in Congo and in Burundi in particular, but elsewhere in the region as well. Part of this is likely related to the low confirmed caseload of COVID at the moment, but there are other confounding factors that have enabled atrocities to continue. I think it's important to remember that while appealing for a global ceasefire is a lofty goal and really important in these times, those perpetrating atrocities, and including in the Great Lakes region, have been doing so with near impunity, complete disregard for international law for a long time. And if they don't care about international law, it will take a lot to convince them of the need to halt atrocities in the midst of a pandemic. And so just to provide a few examples of how these risks are presenting themselves right now and how business as usual is continuing. Earlier today, the head of MONUSCO, the UN peacekeeping mission in Congo, gave a radio address basically warning populations about ongoing activities by armed groups in North Kivu, South Kivu, and Ituri provinces. So sort of recognizing that, yes, please, implement pandemic mitigation measures, but also be aware that there are still physical risks to populations. So security forces have been continuing those offensives against groups that have been perpetrating atrocity crimes for years. So security forces in the Congo launched an offensive against the ADF militia back in November, partly because the ADF has been killing thousands of populations since 2014, but also because the ADF was attacking healthcare facilities in Eastern Congo, limiting the capacity to address an ongoing Ebola crisis. So obviously, not only are there risks to populations as a result of this offensive and the ADF retaliating, but there are also still risks against health facilities if the pandemic were to start spreading in Congo. Similarly, there's been ongoing intercommunal violence in Ituri and South Kivu for many years, and since March, more than 200 civilians have been killed in assaults, largely perpetrated by armed Lendu elements against Hema community. So it's this targeted intercommunal violence that has not stopped as a result of the pandemic risks in the country. Another example, as Tom noted, is the fact that Burundi is still going to hold elections 2 weeks from now. I think many of us were sort of holding our breath, waiting to see whether or not there was going to be some announcement delaying elections, and it just never came. Again, Burundi at the moment is reporting only 20 cases of COVID. Whether that's a true number or not is open to debate, but the reality is that the elections are going forward at a time when the government is restricting civic space further and further, not just because of COVID, but also as sort of a pattern of government behavior. And obviously they're using COVID as a bit of a cover to continue such behavior and continue the restrictions further. So at the current moment, with the dimensions of existing atrocity risks in this region, whether it be election-related triggers in DRC, or election-related triggers in Burundi, or the attacks in DRC, those factors pose almost a greater risk to civilians than COVID at the moment. Now, if COVID were to spread in the region, there are obviously potential devastating impacts. DRC, as a result of ongoing conflicts in the East, is facing the continent's greatest displacement crisis. There are 5.5 million people out of their homes. Those people are living in IDP camps and host communities, and many of them have faced multiple displacements. So if COVID were to spread, there's going to be this tension between populations who can't socially distance in camps and in host communities, and the fact that ongoing attacks may provoke them to flee further or be displaced again. And if you have sort of mass populations who have been exposed to a virus fleeing as a unit, there's obviously greater multiplicative effects for spreading the virus. And DRC, as a result of attacks on health facilities, but also in general, has sort of a weakened medical system. Yes, they've learned a lot from the Ebola crisis, but they also lack the resources that are necessary to treat the disease. So it will have great impacts, but kind of my worry for the DRC and for other aspects of the region is that regardless of whether thousands of people come down with this illness, or if the Great Lakes region is somehow spared, a global pandemic, whether it be COVID-19 or something else, poses profound risks for vulnerable regions like the Great Lakes. COVID at the moment is a trigger for atrocities. We've seen this in other countries where, for example, the risk of already repressive governments using COVID as a guise to perpetrate further abuses against populations, whether that be heavy-handed security forces who are abusing populations while implementing mitigation measures, or the restrictions of civic space that we're seeing in Burundi. I think there are other risks related to stigmatization of refugee and IDP populations as people are fleeing attacks, and sort of how they're confronted by those to places they're fleeing to as a result of perceptions around the illness. And then there's also just the risk that those mandated to protect civilians from armed groups face distrust. And that distrust may create a tension in their ability to provide protection. We've already seen this with MONUSCO in Congo in terms of their ability to protect civilians from the ADF and sort of protests that broke out earlier this year and end of last year around that. So there is a potential for that to be a trigger as well if populations start perceiving that MONUSCO could bring the illness to them. But the bigger issue for the Great Lakes region is sort of the multifaceted consequences of an economic downturn. COVID mitigation measures around the world are obviously having huge economic impacts. They're having economic impacts in the US, where I live, throughout Europe, but then sort of the trickle down of that is going to have grave consequences for the Great Lakes region. We're already seeing market prices for food and resources in Eastern Congo, Burundi are skyrocketing. And the sources of livelihood are now in question as international supply and demand is changing. And when you push that up against the fact that for years, militias in Congo have relied on exploitation of natural resources, exploitation of minerals, to sort of fund their activities, that creates potential for further conflict between those armed groups, further competition for resources, and so forth, and obviously competition for buyers. The other thing to keep in mind here is that it's known that economic inequalities and extreme poverty can be risk factors for atrocities, particularly in areas where other risk factors are present. They have this kind of multiplication effect. Availability of unemployed youth can thus create sort of this resource pool for recruitment into armed groups, which increases atrocity risks. This could be a huge risk in a place like Congo that has hundreds of militias they can be recruited into, but also in Burundi, where the youth wing of the ruling party, the Imbonerakure, is both a popular option for youth to turn to and a main perpetrator in the atrocities in that country. So that sort of multiplies the risks that populations in the Great Lakes region can face. And then there's also the potential long-term impact of decreased funding to all of the sort of protective measures in the countries, whether it be decreased funding to MONUSCO, which is already facing a potential drawdown in the next couple of years, as well as potential decreased funding for humanitarian efforts for those 5.5 million displaced populations. So I think the one thing to keep in mind, though, amidst all these risks, is that there is a bright side for the Great Lakes region in that it's uniquely one of the regions that has a lot of mechanisms for addressing atrocity risks. And I know that Ambassador Mulamula will talk about some of these because she was herself a member of the ICGLR, but the ICGLR, SADC, and African Union are regional mechanisms that support populations in terms of support populations and the governments in mitigating atrocity risks. The UN for several years has participated in the sort of regional peace security framework for the DRC, which is framed around the DRC, framed around halting armed groups, but is actually a mechanism that many states in the Great Lakes have used to negotiate peaceful resolution of issues between them. So those mechanisms remain in place. The peacekeeping mission in DRC has expanded the number of bases in areas where there are increasing risks and has been doing sort of this two-sided COVID mitigation and providing security and supporting security forces activities. But more needs to be done by the states themselves. DRC needs to establish more state authority in the East still, and it needs to engage in further intercommunal dialogue, which obviously will be challenging as a result of COVID because pandemic mitigation measures prevent sort of travel and talking face-to-face between communities and those sorts of activities. Burundi needs to ensure that the elections in 2 weeks are carried out peacefully and are free and fair, but the new government also needs to implement reforms to lift the repressive measures that have been placed for the last 5 years. And if COVID starts to spread more rapidly, governments in the region will obviously have to balance the degree to which offensives are helping mitigate security risks versus amplifying the effect of viral spread if more populations are displaced. So that's the sort of state level. I think internationally, the really big thing to keep in mind is that despite any budgetary and travel constraints caused by COVID, the international community needs to maintain the momentum it has in the Great Lakes region, particularly around human rights monitoring and accountability mechanisms. I think as long as perpetrators are behaving like business as usual, those who investigate their crimes also have to behave like business as usual to some degree. And I think we've seen positive examples of that with the Commission of Inquiry in Burundi, who have already put out a statement basically saying to the government, you can't use COVID as a means to repress populations further. So we just need all of the mechanisms that are doing that to act the same as well.
Many thanks. And now, before we turn to Ambassador Liberata Mulamula, I'd just like to remind the audience that the question and answer button at the bottom of the screen is there to be used, and please do submit any questions which come to you in the course of our panelists' remarks. So now, please, Ambassador.
I don't know whether it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because this being a global conference, we are in different time zones. Let me also start by what we know most as diplomats. We know to thank and thank again. So I'd like to thank you, Thomas, and your team for organizing this video conference, and quite timely. I'm also pleased that you are focusing on this important region of the Great Lakes region, which unfortunately is not known for so many good stories, especially after the aftermath of genocide in Rwanda, the cycle of violence and instability in the DRC, Burundi, Central African Republic, the political tensions, the insecurity caused by the armed groups, and of course, a series of humanitarian crises. I think Jaclyn, she has made my presentation very easy. So let me also start by saying, when we talk of the Great Lakes region, and from the experience I've had teaching the American students, don't take anything for granted. I hope the audience understands how vast is this region. It is defined, of course, geographically, In the past, there were 3 countries that were known as the Great Lakes region, Rwanda, DRC, Uganda, but then politically it has been expanded to include all the countries that neighbor the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Because again, as you have heard from Jaclyn, DRC is always like epicenter of what happens in the region, for bad or good reasons. So you have all these series of countries from Angola, Congo Brazzaville, Central African Republic, the Sudan, Kenya, of course, for the strategic location. You have Zambia also being part of the Great Lakes region in this politically defined context, because when they were launching the international conference on the Great Lakes region, they were saying it is to be all inclusive for those countries that have been part of the conflict, those that have been part of the peacemaking, but also those who are at the center. So it is quite a vast region. And it will take your students, Thomas, the whole semester, if you have to talk about each of these countries. So we'll focus more on those volatile countries, and where we see they are the triggers, maybe of, historically, maybe have been the triggers of these mass atrocities. But let me say the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately also, is reaching the region, or hitting the region at a watershed moment where there has been substantial progress. As I said, good news in the region don't make headlines, but there are some good things that have been happening. We saw the peaceful political transition, the DRC, of course, with a lot of cynicism, a lot of skepticism about the legitimacy of those elections, but at least they were peaceful for the first time in the history of the DRC that you had an election. But also we have seen some signing of various peace agreements in the Central African Republic, where you had also the armed groups signing the peace agreement that was led by the African Union. We have also seen, because there have been border tensions as always, interstate tensions between Uganda and Rwanda. And you saw Angola for the first time mediating these countries and came up with an understanding and agreement to be able to manage their border tensions. So I'm here maybe in what you have said. I was the first executive secretary of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, which of course was established in the aftermath of genocide in Rwanda and the crisis in DRC. So the significance of this conference is that for the first time, the region came together after the late Kofi Annan realized that they cannot bring peace and security in that region from New York, given the experience of what happened with genocide in Rwanda. So he decided that there should be a regional-led solution processes. So they finally, after long deliberations, took years, but they signed what is now known as a regional pact. This is a legally binding pact on peace, security, stability, and development in the region, which has guided whatever interventions are being made is within that pact. And of significance maybe for this talk, the pact had a number of protocols, but one of which was the protocol on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in all forms of discrimination. But there was also a protocol on the fight against the illegal exploitation of natural resources, sexual violence. You mentioned it, there are about 10 protocols. So as Jaclyn said, we have all these mechanisms. We have the legal instruments. So at the time of the signing of the pact, the then president of Tanzania, His Excellency Benjamin Mkapa, if you allow me to quote him, he said, "The states must firmly be placed on notice that the humanity we all share bounds that we should collectively have an interest in human rights, in its promotion, as well as in its protection." So I know Jackie is also part of this Global Center on the responsibility to protect. So this is what, that was the spirit that was taken on board that the region can be the champion of the responsibility to protect. But we all know, and from the assessment that when you are introducing the subject and what Jaclyn has said, that despite all these good sounding instruments, the agreements, of course, the region remains one of the most volatile. And now with this pandemic, although, and surprisingly, the region has not yet been heavily devastated as we witness in other parts of the world. Of course, there are also reasons abound. Some are saying because they don't test, some because they don't want to share the information. Some of the countries like Tanzania has taken I think the Swedish route, which yesterday I heard the WHO was saying that should be the model. There's no lockdown in Tanzania. It's business, most is business as usual. Of course, a little bit of less of social distancing, and of course the social gatherings have become less. But from their own people, seeing what is happening in the other parts of the world. But then we know that the region has also experienced deadly pandemics. This is not the first one. Maybe the magnitude is bigger, but we have seen how the region was devastated by the HIV/AIDS, how the region, of course, has been devastated by what you mentioned, I don't know, cholera, measles, but also the Ebola. It didn't spare this region. And it is recently in DRC, you must have been following what has been happening. But what is also always surprising is the resilience of the communities, how they overcome, despite all these weak infrastructures, but then you find that mostly they overcome. But then what is most feared is that given this background, the fragility of the countries, the weak institutions, the weak infrastructures, that this pandemic, of course, would lead to very debilitating socio-economic and humanitarian consequences. There's no question about it. So that's why the current health crisis is not only seen as a health crisis in this region, but it's also seen as a security threat, especially in the post-conflict countries. So that's why I find, and I want to thank you, that we use this time to reflect critically on the risk factors presented by this pandemic in the regional efforts to make the prevention of mass atrocities a priority. This has been a priority since the Rwanda genocide. They said never again, but then we always see reports of this pandemic. So the question, before, I don't know how much time I have, but then I would like all to focus on what are the risk factors. Of course, they have been enumerated by Jaclyn. But then I must say that, I don't know, there is a South African-based civil society organization called Accord. As you hear, Honda Accord. So this Accord, it is Africa Center for Constructive Resolution of Disputes. They have established a system which they call, it's a conflict resilience monitor. They monitor weekly on the impact of the pandemic in terms of causing social unrest, conflicts, and these atrocities. So for this week, the report says that there is no evidence of in the overall number of social unrest or violent conflicts in the region and Africa, of course, as a result of the COVID pandemic. But then, where they alert us is that they are what they call fault lines. The fault lines that are emerging due to the measures taken to contain the pandemic, and which increases political tensions, it heightens the risk of social unrest and violent conflict in the future in the African continent. So there are a number of areas they use as targets to monitor. So I would like to maybe to recommend that use also this tool to see what is happening around the continent. But most important, what they have seen is that there is an erosion of trust between the citizens and institutions, and also trust on how some of the governments are handling this pandemic. So they say this is a source of that will cause more tensions and maybe violent actions. But also there is increasing the cross-border interstate tensions. So, you know, some of the countries have crossed the borders completely. But some of the countries, of course, like Tanzania has not crossed its borders, but the neighbors have crossed its borders. But the peoples are affected because there is so much of this cross-border movement of goods, of people. So now if they get to the border and then there is excessive use of force by the security forces, so there have been a number of cases that have been reported from this. But also, Jaclyn has mentioned the region is littered by the armed groups, by the militias. So there is also a concern and also some reports that these groups, while the government's attentions are on the pandemic, they are regrouping, they are mobilizing, but they're also connecting with the international terror networks, violent extremist groups. So that is one, I mean, there's this big fear that these groups would be connecting with the international terror groups. She has also mentioned about the call by the Secretary General on global ceasefire, that he has called, that it's time to put armed conflict on lockdown and focus together on the true fight of our lives. But also the African Union has called on the agents to silence the guns, calling on the belligerent to stop fighting. And the chairperson of the African Union has said it's a moral and humanitarian obligation for warring parties, wherever they may be in Africa, to immediately stop fighting, to facilitate measures being taken by member states and other actors to combat and defeat coronavirus pandemic. Surprisingly, there are reports that some of these armed groups have yielded to these calls. They have, in solidarity in the fight against COVID-19, but also have also declared to promote peaceful coexistence by preventing conflicts through dialogue and mediation. So these rebel groups in the Central African Republic that have signatory agreements, but they were not joining, but now they have. So we hope they are not calling the bluff. And they are in South Sudan also, those that are rebel groups that were outside of the peace and power sharing, now they have joined. So there is this kind of good news. I don't know how long it will last because knowing our region. There's also cases of widespread domestic violence, gender-based violence, and sexual violence. And this is attributed to families confined to quarantine and lockdown measures, you can imagine. And of course, there is no enforcement of the rule of law, the registration are suspended. So this is also another area where you need to focus and see, because these are crimes against humanity when in mass. And we have also heard, I mean, in our region is known for heightened political tensions and violence during and after elections, which have characterized the region. Jaclyn has mentioned the risk to watch in Burundi, because from my experience, when there is no crisis, nobody pays attention. But when there is crisis, there is mass atrocities, then there is this stampede of actors, of international communities, of the UN, everybody wanting to be seen on CNN, but it's always too little, too late. So this is why through this forum, let's draw the attention of what might happen in Burundi, what might happen in Central African Republic, because they also have elections this year, 2020, when they all, I mean, 1/3 of the country is still under armed groups occupation. So how are they going to have these elections? So these are the areas that we need to focus on. Of course, the shrinking space of the civil society, the suppression of dissenting voices as mentioned by Jaclyn. This is what also causes like triggers of what mass atrocities has been in the past. And of course, suspension of parliaments. In most of the countries, the parliaments are not meeting. So now the governance of the country is left in the hands of the president, who are some of the president issuing decrees that are seen as suppressive. Some of like there is election, but then you are not allowed to campaign. It's only the ruling party. So there are those issues that are, but to end on a positive note, as the saying goes, that for every crisis, there is an opportunity. I see an opportunity here. Because what the health crisis has shown, if anything, that is that prevention works, and that prevention and protection go hand in hand. This has always been our message. But also, it has shown that investment in prevention measures is possible with the participation of the private sector. So let's build on this, some good practice that is coming out of this. But also we have seen that the health interventions are people-centered. This is people-centered approach and inclusivity is the heart of the UN even social sustainable development goals. But you have seen how it has been done, because the policies of exclusion is what has been at the center of the conflicts and where the peace in the region has failed. So in short, I must say there are some good things that we need to build momentum on it, the social cohesion, the unity of purpose at the global level, at the regional level. These are some of the good things that are coming out of the COVID pandemic. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Ambassador. And finally, before we begin taking questions from the floor, and I'm sure we have many, please, Scott Strauss.
Great, well, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this panel, and it's an honor to be on this virtual panel with my other two panelists, and thank you all for tuning in. I thought I would offer an academic perspective on the question of the relationship between COVID-19 or pandemics in general and the risk of mass atrocities, and I wanted to make 5 general points. So the first is that I think the literature on mass atrocities and genocide doesn't actually have much on the question of pandemics. That is, the literature is fairly thin on a potential risk that would be created by pandemics. I think the place where you see some play in that question is around indigenous populations, in particular in the Americas, where huge numbers of people lost their lives because of disease. There's perhaps a linkage there to the Great Lakes, which I'll come back to towards the end. But I'd say the literature overall is not much of a guide. It doesn't indicate whether or not there's an elevated risk or a decreased risk of the onset of mass atrocities. That said, I thought I would play out a couple of hypothetical scenarios in which one might see a linkage develop. So the first is probably the most common condition for mass atrocities is where those in power face a new or newly strong threat to their power. So one scenario for an elevated risk due to COVID-19 would some kind in a ruling party or in a military apparatus, which in turn an armed opposition or an opposition of some kind tries to exploit, which in turn triggers a mass atrocity response. So I think you could see this potentially developing in an electoral environment where a ruling party feels that somehow their coordinating ability or surveillance ability is weakened and they need to use atrocities in order to secure a victory. You could see it in an insurgency context in which insurgents decide that the state military is weaker for whatever reason. Maybe disease hits the barracks of a particular army and then that military responds with mass atrocities. Or you could possibly see it in the context of a coup where you have divisions and factions within a ruling military, and that they take advantage of this particular scenario, which then triggers, again, mass atrocity. So I think this is fairly unlikely in the sense that is the scenario where there's a vulnerability that armed opposition groups would take advantage of, in the sense that I think that opponents to states or to those in power are as much at risk or as much affected as states are by this disease. And so I'm not sure that I would put that much stock in this particular scenario. I think a second scenario is one of kind of targeted neglect. And I think here the argument could be that states are arbiters of life-saving care, possibly of treatments or eventually vaccines, and a particular group is denied access to those life-saving resources. In some ways, that actually is the lesson from the indigenous cases in the Americas, where disease spread because of displacement and dispossession, but also because letting the disease spread was serve the interests of settlers and the new states that were being established by European powers and so forth. So again, I think this is potentially an unlikely scenario as well, in the sense that were states to deny particular groups life-saving care or treatments or vaccines, I think that would be heavily criticized by domestic civil society, by regional actors, and by international actors, and there'd be pressure for humanitarian access. But nonetheless, this strikes me as a possible scenario of a linkage between pandemic and mass atrocity risks. I think a third scenario, and both Liberata and Jaclyn have suggested this as well, is that a pandemic forces some kind of drawing down or withdrawal or weakening of observers, of external forces or domestic civil society that serve as observers, that can lead to a rise of either state on civilian violence or intercommunal violence, in the sense that you have less potential negative consequences or less outcry when such violence is taking place because of the forced withdrawal of these observers. And you could see this perhaps playing out in Ituri or the Kivus, as Jaclyn suggested. And I think this is probably the most likely of the scenarios of the ones that I'm painting, but it's hard to say exactly if it will come to pass. And then I think the last scenario is perhaps a more optimistic one, and here I'll end where Liberata did as well, and that is that a pandemic actually reduces the risk of mass atrocities. And I could see this playing out in a couple different ways. I mean, one is that the capacity of states is interrupted because their ability to coordinate, their ability to mount an offensive, and also their interest in doing so might decrease, because they might say to themselves, look, we have other fish to fry. We're not concerned right now about this potential armed opposition group or this potential threat to our power. We're concerned right now with containing this threat from this disease. And as a result, they don't invest in mass atrocities. So in this scenario, I think you could see either because of lack of capacity, because there's some type of interruption to their capacity to inflict violence, or because of lack of interest or the incentives would decrease, that states would not pursue mass atrocities as a strategy to keeping power. So that's really what I thought I would have to say, contribute to this discussion. I will just end with a caveat that social scientists are very bad at predicting the future, and it's very difficult to know exactly what will happen. And thank you again for inviting me to participate.
Many thanks for your interventions. And now we'll turn to questions from the floor. And just to remind our audience, please do submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, mentioning whether your question is directed to a particular panelist or to the panel in general, and also noting your name and your university or other affiliation if you have one. Thank you. And I'll also ask our panelists that we might keep our responses to the questions relatively brief, as I'm conscious of the time. And our first question is specifically directed to the ambassador, but I think our other panelists would also probably like to provide an answer. It comes from Paridi Singh of Cambridge University, who asks, can this pandemic provide an opportunity to improve cross-country cooperation in the region, which would be important to tackle the pandemic if it spirals out of control?
Yeah, this is for me, right? Okay. Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, actually, one of the silver lining out of this, the pandemic, I've seen for the first time that the leaders at different levels, at the heads of state levels, at the experts levels, at the ministers of levels, they are meeting through this virtual means and trying to find a way how they can work together collectively in tackling this pandemic. And they of course, at the end of this meeting, they always, they issue communiques that are always general in nature. But I'm sure that amongst them, they discuss maybe honestly on seeing maybe when they see some of their peers or some of their neighbors, they're not taking the measures that they should. So I think what has been coming out, even as last week, they were still meeting and trying to find how together they can tackle this. So in terms of enhancing cooperation, we have seen but then as now the trend throughout the world, there's so much inward looking. It's of course they agree at that regional level, but how they act is just about, like the Americans say, America first. So it is more on the nationalism more than this collaboration that is projected. So it is everyone fending for themselves. Yeah, that's what I see. But the spirit of cooperation, I see it has been very enhanced also in the midst of this pandemic.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jaclyn, would you also like to tackle this one?
I would just say that I agree with what the ambassador said, that so far, at least, it seems like the pandemic is improving cooperation between the leaders. Even mechanisms that they already had in place, they seem to be using more as sort of a pre-existing tool that they can mobilize to have discussions about COVID. So I mentioned earlier the peace and security framework for the DRC, which is more of a regional mechanism, even though DRC is in its title. And they've already met once in April, and I think have plans to meet again soon, and discussed specifically sort of COVID measures and how to address COVID risks. They actually didn't touch on, at least in the communique, they didn't touch on much in terms of their normal business conversations. So I think that that's kind of the trend we're seeing at the moment. But if resource constraints start to become an issue, it'll be interesting to see how internal the states turn.
And Scott, would you like to?
I mean, just very quickly, without being too negative, and I don't think this applies just to the region, I would say I wouldn't assume that any cooperation that occurs regarding the disease is going to necessarily carry over into other arenas once it passes. And particularly when states care about particular issues, that they may go well back to having conflict and tension. So,
thank you, and perhaps staying with Scott initially for this question from Albini Saragu. Do you believe that the Western lockdown model could work in the African context to fight the COVID-19 pandemic?
I mean, I think lower income states in general are faced with different kinds of management challenges than there are in higher income states. And so I think one of the big challenges is social distancing in a lot of African environments, where you have many people who are sharing space together, where people need to travel in order to get access to clean water or get access to food. They're not getting Amazon deliveries or however someone gets their food deliveries. So I think the lockdown model is, I think is probably poses more challenges for many African states. At the same time, I think a lot of different African states have imposed that model and it seems to have worked. I mean, I think I'm not an expert in this area, but my sense is that the transmission rates in Africa are on the low end on a global scale. And so I think that's a positive story here coming out of the continent, but it's not my area of expertise, so I don't know that you put too much stock in my answer there.
Thank you. And Ambassador, would you like to address that, particularly from the Tanzanian perspective?
Yes, let me also support what Professor Scott has said. The African way of tackling this pandemic has been quite different. If I say for Tanzania, our president has said it's not cut and paste. So they have, as I said at the beginning, they avoided the complete lockdown. They said that cannot work because people, they subsist on everyday basis, on day-to-day basis. As they say, it's hand to mouth. So if say you shut down a city like Dar es Salaam, then it means you have killed the entire population Dar es Salaam, because they can go to the market. There's no way, because in the Western world, you can stock things in the refrigerators, you can get the tin. For us, it's just you get the fresh food, you get the fresh meat. So that's why the president said there's no way over my dead body. And I think that has also helped to save the lives of people not going hungry, and also save also the violence that we have seen in South Africa. People are saying we are dying of hunger instead of the virus. The virus is not going to kill us. We're going to be killed by the hunger. So I think they have avoided that. And the World Bank has also acknowledged that for some of the African countries that they're not cut and paste, it's taking into consideration a lot of factors, including the informal economy, because almost 70% of our economies are informal, and where also the women are. So while protecting, but then they were saying lockdown cannot work in our circumstances. And I also seem to appreciate maybe some of the policies, although not everything what they say.
Wonderful, thank you. And Jaclyn, I'll hope you'll excuse me if, given the time, I don't actually give you an opportunity to address that question, unless you have a very, very burning desire to say one or two words. But I'll actually give you first refusal on the next question, which has come from Rory Grant, and he asks, is there any further experience or is there any further information of the gendered experience of COVID in the region so far? And particularly how this might intersect with the gendered dimension of atrocity crimes?
I mean, from what I've seen so far, there hasn't been a very gendered dimension to the spread of the illness, or sort of the measures taken to mitigate the spread. But obviously, this is a region that has kind of a history of problems with widespread sexual violence, either, as the ambassador mentioned, in the form of domestic violence, which has been on the rise during COVID, not just in the Great Lakes region, but all over the world, but also in places like the Congo, where armed groups, as well as the military, have a history of using sexual violence as a tool and as a weapon of war. And I think that in that regard, as long as sort of the atrocity risks remain high, the risk of those types of crimes continuing will also remain high, and women will remain kind of vulnerable populations, or at least vulnerable to these types of attacks. I think one thing that's sort of interesting, it's not really an atrocity related thing, is that, you know, female populations are still very central to sort of the life of the communities. And so if you take a look at, you know, MONUSCO's Twitter feed, for example, you see that over the past few weeks, a lot of their programming related to COVID has been directed at sort of this gendered treatment of things, either because they think that women are better at spreading information and are central to the family, and thus will implement mitigation measures better, or because women are still sort of actively, and this kind of goes to the lockdown thing, are still actively out there going to the markets, collecting resources in the fields and so forth. And that puts them both at sort of greater capacity to control the spread of COVID, but also at higher risk as other things are going on.
Thank you. And given the time, apologies, I'm not going to pass that question on for now to our other guests. But Scott, I have a question here from Felicity Garvey of Murray Edwards College at the University of Cambridge. To what extent does the panel believe that authoritarian changes to the status quo, such as reduced civil liberties and the removal of foreign observers, are likely to stick? And what is to be done to ensure a transition out of the crisis that works to reduce the probability of mass atrocity after the crisis?
Okay, excellent question. I think on the first part of that question, I think the answer is that I would say that, I don't know exactly what will happen, but the trends will certainly be in that direction, meaning that I would expect that we'll continue to see democratic backsliding in the region and or continued authoritarian rule in the region. And I think that many foreign states and international organizations are going to be under severe budgetary constraints in the future and will have to prioritize and are facing both nationalist and populist pressures from their constituencies to, to kind of recenter on their own states. And that's going to, I think, only increase. So I think we can expect, I would anticipate we can expect both political pressure and budgetary constraints that are going to push international observation away from mass atrocity prevention and from observation. The second part of the question, can you remind me, Tom? I'm sorry. The second part of the question was about
what is to be done to ensure a transition out of the crisis that works to reduce the probability of mass atrocity after the crisis?
I think that's a really great question. I don't know that I have any magic bullets. I think that, long-term, any type of mass atrocity prevention is going to come from domestic sources. It's going to have to come from, the citizens of the country itself, from civil society, from the political class, from the military, from et cetera. And so I think perhaps this could create, as Liberata suggested, create an opportunity to refocus on domestic actors rather than international ones. And perhaps that's naive to suggest, but I think long-term that's ultimately where prevention has to be rooted. It has to be rooted within the societies themselves and within the political institutions and military institutions themselves.
Many thanks. And the final question is now to Ambassador Mulamula, and please do in 20 or 30 seconds if you can. Unfortunately, it's a very, very good question, a very big question. We'll make sure we get it. It's from Thomas Moredo from Brazil. And he asks, what can the UN do to change their image throughout the local domestic population who are affected by mass atrocities?
Maybe in 20 seconds, I can say, of course, the UN, the best it can do is to work with the local actors, with the civil societies, because they have a coordinated and coherent approach in dealing with this crisis. And I always remind the UN, I said, you are not the only actor on the ground. So for the UN is to facilitate, but to work with a multitude of actors, including the women, the youth, the civil society, engage the government on top of it. So I must say they need to be coordinated, to have a coherent approach within themselves, but also to be able to engage the society and the local actors. It's important. They should not be prescriptive of solutions.
Wonderful, thank you. That was very succinct to a very big question, and it's now time to bring a close to the panel. Unfortunately, there's so much we could have spoken about, and it's a very, very interesting topic. And I thank our guests very much, Ambassador Liberata Mulamula, Jaclyn Steinfeld-Hall, and Professor Scott Strauss. I would like to thank all of you in the audience as well, in particular for your many delving and thought-provoking questions. And I apologize to those of you whose questions we unfortunately didn't have time to get around to. And please do check back shortly on the Centre's website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk. That's www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk, where the video of this discussion will soon be available to view. And I hope also that you will be able to join another of our upcoming panels. Next week, Wednesday the 13th of May, at the same time, 6 p.m. UK time, we will be joined, among others, by Simon Adams, Executive Director of the Global Centre for Responsibility to Protect, to discuss R2P, international justice, and the battle for impunity. And we also have another panel coming up in this R2P series, which is quite closely related to what we're talking about today, looking at the politics of shelter in displaced persons camps. And so I hope you can also join that panel, and please do check back regularly on our website where we will update information accordingly. So thank you again from the Centre for Geopolitics. Thank you again to our guests and to our audience, and we hope to see you soon.